Okay, so as I mentioned, this discourse called Crossing the Flood is from the Devata Saṃyutta. The Samyutta Nikāya, most of you probably know, but if you don't, is a collection of what's called the connected discourses of the Buddha, one of the several groupings along, say, with the Majjhima Nikāya, the Digha Nikāya, Anguttara Nikāya, etc. But this one is the Saṃyutta Nikāya, and they're collection of discourses, some longer, some shorter, that are grouped together by category of subject matter, very roughly speaking. Just one of the ways that the canon was organized as it was pulled together after the time of the Buddha. And there were a number of discourses, most of them fairly short, that had in the part of the subject is that they were discourses that were given to devatas, celestial beings that are not part of our particular orientation here, but they are part of the Buddhist cosmology. Amir, could you repeat? Yes, that'd be great, thanks. Part of the Buddhist cosmology, and oftentimes would come and, usually in the middle of the night, come and ask the Buddha for some teachings. So the Buddha would spend his day teaching human beings, and then oftentimes when everybody was asleep and the day was long over in the middle of the night, then the devatas would approach him for their teachings. So this is one of those times, and often the teachings to the devatas were quite beautiful, oftentimes in the format of question and answer, actually as many of the teachings were given in the format of question and answer. So I'll just go ahead and read the sutta. It's quite short, as I said, and then we'll discuss it a bit. So, crossing the flood. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi in Jeta's grove, Anathapindika's park. Then, when the night had advanced, a certain devata of stunning beauty, illuminating the entire Jeta's grove, approached the Blessed One. Having approached, he paid homage to the Blessed One, stood to one side, and said to him, "How, dear sir, did you cross the flood?" "By not halting, friend, and by not straining, I crossed the flood." "But how is it, dear sir, that by not halting and by not straining you crossed the flood?" "When I came to a standstill, friend, then I sank. But when I struggled, then I got swept away. It is in this way, friend, that by not halting and by not straining I crossed the flood." Then the devata replies in verse, "After a long time at last I see a Brahman who is fully quenched, who by not halting, not straining, has crossed over attachment to the world." This is what that devata said. The teacher approved. Then that devata, thinking, the teacher has approved of me, paid homage to the Blessed One, and keeping him on the right, disappeared right there. That's it. But I think if we all fully understood this, there wouldn't be much more we needed to do. So that's straightforward. So a couple of things just to maybe start out with. Talking about crossing the flood, the word, the Pali word for flood is ogha, O-G-H-A, ogha. And it actually obviously is a metaphorical reference in this case. And there's a lot of different ways that one could think of it. Most broadly, the flood of samsara, the round of birth and death that we are entwined with and have been since an inconceivable time, and will be if we don't pull ourselves out of it. But it's also used, and I think it's worth considering this aspect of it, referring to the four ogas, which the Buddha talks about, the four floods. And it very much correlates with the asavas, which many of you have heard of, what the Buddha refers to as, it's translated in various ways. Asava as outflows is the most common that we use, sometimes influxes, fermentations, fabrications, different kinds of things like that. But yeah, I think Ajahn Jeff is effluence or fermentations. He uses both of those. But outflows is the one that I generally tend to use. And actually, I think I maybe gave a talk on that a number of weeks ago on the four asavas. And the asavas are what's referred to, if you'll remember, on the night of the Buddha's enlightenment. In the third watch of the night, he basically saw to the ending of the asavas. So the outflows of mind that keeps one bound up in samsara were overcome on the night of his enlightenment. So the four asavas and the four ogas are actually the same, but with a different kind of connotation. Oga as a flood, as opposed to just an outflow, kind of has the connotation of an asava that's really like an asava on steroids, completely full on outflow of the mind, so that it's going for it big time, really, is how you can think of that, I think. So there are the four asavas, or the four floods, the four ogas, kamasawa, or kamoga, bhavasawa, or bhavoga, ditasawa, or ditoga, and avijasawa, or avijoga, depending on whether it's the asava or the flood. And those are the flood of sensuality, the flood of becoming, the flood of views and opinions, and the flood of ignorance. And these are the four outflows, or the four floods that keep us bound in samsara. So it's useful thinking that, the Buddha saw different levels of these kinds of obstructions in the mind, some that were quite subtle, and some that were just full force, and made a distinction between them. So the asavas and the ogas. So this can be seen as part of the flood that the Buddha is referring to, at least in this sutta, and what it is, how to cross the flood is the question in mind. How did you cross the floods of sensuality, becoming, views, ignorance? And the Buddha, in a very beautiful way, mentions these two aspects of by neither halting nor straining. And it's curious, you can see he doesn't actually say, here's how I did it. He says, by not doing these two things is how I crossed the flood. So if you think about it, the aspect of halting is, and that's what he says, is when he came to a standstill, when he halted, then he sank. But when he strained or struggled or tried to push against the flow of the flood, it's when he got swept away. So, you kind of think, well, gosh, if you don't stop and you don't keep going, what do? How does that work? And it's kind of fun to start parsing that out a bit. So, because you can think that by stopping, say if you're in a flood, whether it's a flood of all of your sensuality or views or becoming, ignorance, those kinds of things, or in the middle of a stream. If you just stop and do nothing, essentially, you're just kind of going to inaction as a result of that, then you sink. You make no effort, you just give in to the momentum of whatever it is that's happening, and you just fall under their influence completely. And you can see that, with, like, say, with the realm of the senses. If you're involved in a lot of sensual indulgence, then you're just kind of letting that flood of sensuality overcome you, and you're not making any effort to understand it or work with it. You're just allowing yourself to sink with it. And if it's a flood, just to be completely overwhelmed, going for it big time. Such as, really just, this is an example, like the flood of sensual indulgence in the realm of taste. The sense bases are what we're involved with, so that you might be really initially attracted to feeling a bit hungry and want to get something really nice to eat, and that's kind of the asava, the outflow of sensuality starting to take hold, and then you go for it, and you get into this really delicious food, and you just keep going, and even though you're full, you just you don't care, and you just abandon all caution to the wind and get into it and completely overdo it until you get so sick that you just collapse. That's probably being caught up in the flood. So initially you might just have a little bit of an interest, and perks up a bit of interest and movement towards it as an outflow, but then you just give yourself over to it. So, and that can happen, of course, in any of the sense bases, attractive sights, sounds, tastes, tactile sensations. Sexuality is, of course, a big one. And then also the attractions of the mind, the intellect, all the thoughts and ideas, small and great, that we can get ourselves lost into and allow ourselves to be completely overwhelmed in the flood of thoughts, emotions. So the flood or the asava of becoming, forming an identity, just wishing for existence, being, not wanting to think that there's a possible ending, but even more so in the whole realm of roles and responsibilities, our place in the world, our reputation, our status, those kinds of things where we really develop a strong sense of self, strong sense of identity in relation to the world, how we define ourselves in relation to other people, the comparisons that we make with ourselves, between ourselves and other people, for better or for worse. All of that falls within the realm of becoming. So we can get quite involved and intoxicated with our self-identity, how we view ourselves, and how we set up ourselves to receive rewards and praise, that kind of thing, getting caught in the flood of becoming. Views and opinions are a strong one, as everybody probably recognizes as well. How easy it is to have an opinion about something, the righteousness of something, social justice, social injustice, politics. It's a big one these days, and a lot of what's happening in the world. Western world in particular, but the world in general in terms of politics these days is becoming very polarized. You can just see it. The people are so having strong tendencies these days to polarize, take strong and firm sides, react very quickly, react very strongly, and hold on to them very strongly to the camps. Politics and social issues are really digging in. People are becoming quite entrenched and not listening very much to each other. It seems like a lot these days. So the flood of views is a real noticeable one these days. Just if you tune into the news at all, you can see the damage that's done with that when people stop listening to each other. So it's, not only in politics and social life, but just in our interactions with people all through the day. How painful it can be sometimes when we really, cling to our views, our opinions. Righteous indignation, that's a biggie. How much juice we get out of being indignant. Really energizing state of mind, but pretty destructive. So that's one of the floods. And then the flood, the big flood of ignorance, avijja, avijoga, the flood of ignorance. Just the not knowing what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, the motives behind it, the inevitable endlessness of trying to seek satisfaction, seek happiness in ways that are only temporary, not seeing the Four Noble Truths, really, not seeing that there is a vast layer of suffering that we add to much of our experience that is avoidable, not understanding that there is a path leading to the end of suffering. And that, of course, is the fundamental flood that we're entrenched in, getting caught up in, being swept away by, sinking in, that underlies all of them. So halting by inaction, one gives into that momentum, sinks under the influence of these various floods of mind. And then straining is also a kind of wrong effort. It's excessive or misdirected reaction to these floods, so that you can get caught up in a lot of resistance or straining in trying to counteract the unpleasant floods when you aren't sinking in it and giving yourself over to it, and you've started to want to develop some way to get out of it. If it's based in aversion or this wish for non-becoming, vibhava tanha, the wish for annihilation, to be through it all, to end it, to not have to deal with it, then one can get swept away. The Buddha talks about the two extremes that one should avoid in the sutta, the first Dhammacakka Sutta that we talk about, the extremes of sense indulgence and self-mortification. And probably he was referring, in terms of self-mortification, referring to a lot of the ascetic practices that were happening at his time, during his time, and that he was involved with too before he realized the middle way, that of essentially self-torture with starvation and barely eating anything and taking up certain ascetic practices that were meant to purify karma, but that really just depleted the physical and mental energies to the point where he wasn't able to meditate, practice, contemplate, in realizing that was an extreme overreaction and wasn't working. So that's one aspect of it, but that kind of attitude of self-mortification or self-torture doesn't just have to be physical in the extreme, but we often see it in ourselves more in terms of psychological self-torture. A strong negative way that we approach the world, self-blaming, a lot of proliferation, the whole guilt trip thing that we can do on ourselves and other people's. I sort of see that as a psychological form of self-mortification. So that would be, trying to cross the flood, trying to get rid of the suffering that we experience with overreaction and kind of misdirected effort, if you will, misdirected kind of effort. So what do you do about it? If you don't want to halt and you don't want to strain, then it's worth considering the teachings that the Buddha talks on in terms of right effort. It isn't that there is no effort that's involved in crossing the flood, but the middle way that he talks about is one that is wrapped around right effort, which is, of course, one of the Eightfold Path. That's the way that you can help, at least in a mundane sense, in a worldly sense, help to cross the flood by neither halting and sinking, nor by getting swept away through excessive strain. So the four right efforts that the Buddha talks about are all involved around the development of wholesome qualities that support the process, the practice towards liberation, and abandoning the unwholesome qualities that are obstructions on the way. So the efforts are involved both towards developing, and in a sense that's a becoming of some sort, but a skillful becoming. So developing those wholesome, skillful qualities that we haven't yet developed. And then, as its counterpart, or the second part of developing wholesome qualities, is maintaining, keeping up the ones that we have developed. So developing new ones and maintaining the ones that we have some skill with. So these are all the supportive conditions of mind that are useful to create and to develop. All the paramis, patience and generosity, and determination, and all the qualities of truthfulness and kindness, metta, loving kindness, equanimity, determination. There's 10 of them. I've left out a few, but you get the sense of these are the qualities that we develop in our practice and in our minds. And they help sustain, uplift, and provide a base of goodness in our hearts that propels us along this path. So developing and maintaining those, and at the same time starting to recognize those ones that pull you down, that drag you down in this approach, and starting to work to abandon those, let go of them, not to pretend that they're not there or to push them away, or to get involved, like I was saying, with this self-blaming or guilt kind of a thing that is self-mortification and straining, but by recognizing and feeling the pain of them when they come up, the jealousy or the anger or the incredible craving that can come up, these different states of mind that we would consider obstructive. They're not peaceful, are they? They're just what pulls us into unhappiness and suffering. So we work to recognize them and see the pain that they're causing, and to gradually, through that recognition, let them go. Not push them away, but understand them, fully understand them. That's the first noble truth, fully understanding dukkha, is to be able to feel it, feel the effects of it, and create a determination that says, okay, well, I've done that enough. I've had enough of that. How can I find my way out? Is there an alternative? And to work from there. And then once those have been abandoned, we also have to keep in mind not to let them sprout up again until the mind is completely pure. So those are the four right efforts, which I think, in my mind, are the mundane path, if you will, or the path of the world to cross the flood. So as I was thinking about these, I also was reminded of a story from the suttas as well, with a monk, Venerable Sona was his name, and he was, I think, a half-brother of the Buddha. Maybe he was the son of the Buddha's father and the Buddha's stepmother, I believe, Sona, if I've got that right. I may have conflated that with another monk, but anyway, Venerable Sona. So don't quote me on this one, on the relationship. But anyway, he was a very sincere practitioner and a monk, and was had a tendency towards over-striving. And the Buddha, he was a former musician, and at one point during his path of practice, he was walking back and forth on his walking path very energetically, and to the point where he kept it up so long that he was getting bleeding sores and blisters on his feet from the striving and the effort. And part of his recollection was, I've really put so much effort into this practice. I've thrown myself into this completely, and I still haven't realized the benefits of the practice. Maybe I should just abandon the path at this point, go back to the home life, earn money, live a good life, enjoy myself, and make a lot of merit. And maybe that's what I should do rather than strive with the practice. And the Buddha picked this up in his all-seeing mental faculties and went to Sona and asked him if this was the thought he had, and Sona admitted to it. And then the Buddha, using an analogy from Venerable Sona's life as a musician, said, well, when you were a musician and you were playing the lute, if the strings were tuned too tightly, would it make a pleasing sound? And he said, no. If they were tuned too loosely, would they make a pleasing sound? And he said, no. So the teaching being that the lute had to be tuned just right, not too tight, not too loose, and then you'll get a pleasing sound from it. And of course, the teaching being that that's how we have to tune our practice. If we're too loose and too lax, then we won't get good results. And if we're too tight and over-striving, then we won't get good results either. So Sona took that to heart and was able to, by tuning down a little bit and balancing his practice, was able to then realize the full fruits of the practice. So I was thinking about the whole not too tight, not too loose analogy and along these four floods, the floods of sensuality, becoming, views, and ignorance. And kind of thinking, okay, well, at least in terms of sensuality, too loose is that kind of overindulgence, overstimulation that I was mentioning. And how would you deal with that? How do you work with that? If you find yourself kind of a bit loose and sinking into the floods of sensuality, what should you do? You want to somehow start limiting your indulgence or your overstimulation through some sort of restraint. And starting out possibly with actually reflecting on the consequences of doing something. And the best time to do that is before you do it, which is of course hard because along with the flood of sensuality comes sort of a clouding of our awareness. We get caught up in the flow of it and give ourselves over to it and just kind of enter this foggy state of confusion because the impulses are so strong and the desire is so strong. And and when you think about it too, the flood of desire, we think of it as kind of like interesting or exciting, and in a sense it is, but it's also painful. And it's that painfulness of that sensual desire, that flood of sensual desire, it's the painful aspect of it that we're trying to get rid of by gratifying the desire itself. And we have learned that flow can be ameliorated, that desire, that painful desire can be ameliorated, at least temporarily, by actually seeking and getting the object of our gratification. And there's no denying that there's a sense of relief when that happens. The problem being that it's short-lived, and it just kind of fuels the fire for the same desire to arise, maybe with a different object or the same object sometime down the road. So before just continuing that cycle, you have to catch yourself, and as it's starting to arise, to say, okay, well, what's going to happen if I do this again? You know, yeah, it'll feel okay for a while, feel good for a while, and then it'll fade, and then it'll come back. Maybe even stronger if it's a real addictive kind of a thing that we're doing, because we develop tolerance to our activities. So really taking the self-discipline to be noticing when it's just starting to arise, and to say, hold on. You know, do I really, really want to do this? And if you think about it and come to the conclusion that it's not going to work in the long run, then the sooner you catch it, the easier it is to just cut it off and turn your attention to something that's more skillful. So reflecting before acting. Think before you act. And just starting to, at times, start really setting some clear personal boundaries, some clear personal limits as to what you think is acceptable and useful in the realm of the senses. You know, maybe it's more along the addictive lines of, you know, the media, social media, things like you know, using the internet or internet surfing, all those kinds of things that, you know, how many times a day do we go to our phone and, you know, check our messages, check our emails, check out something on the web. Just that sense of distractedness, that sense of how we get so involved in the world of distraction, and to set some limits. You know, maybe what are some reasonable limits? You know, okay, twice a day I'll check it. You know, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, or if that's not enough, 3 times a day. But just to put some boundaries, put some limits on it, and then to really make a determination. A lot of times, that's one of the techniques that the monks will use here at the monastery and oftentimes making a special determination during this 3-month vasa where we're committed to stay here at this monastery, is to choose something special to kind of focus on and to set some boundaries around, to see if one can get some insight into some of the habits of the mind. So a person might make a determination for 3 months to only eat 1 meal a day rather than 2 meals a day if they have strong craving for food, or to limit the kinds of food that they eat if there's a lot of craving. So some, you know, mild austerity practice, or if they really just love to sleep, you know, sleep can be just as delicious as food, and to make a determination to, you know, only sleep a certain number of hours a day, or to get up, you know, no matter what by a certain time, and that sometimes making those determinations and telling somebody else about them, and maybe even establishing some consequences for yourself if you don't meet up to it, are useful ways to help that too loose holding of the flood of sensuality. And also, you know, the need to avoid the opposite extreme, which can happen, so that, you know, like at the time of the Buddha, starving oneself, people sometimes would get into, and yeah, and I can see that sometimes here too. People really want to take up some austerities, and sometimes people develop an attitude of negativity towards the body, so they get ill and they feel sick, but won't tell anybody, won't receive treatment. And if taken to an extreme, we can really make ourselves sick. Disregard. I remember there was many years ago, there was a young idealistic monk who basically, and he was starting this whole kind of mindset before he was in the monastery, but he had kind of an aversion around the body that was couched in kind of I don't want to be attached to my body. The Buddha says we shouldn't be attached to the body, so it developed as more of an aversive kind of a thing, and part of that is like he just thought it was ridiculous that people would go to a dentist to ever get work done on their teeth. So he didn't see a dentist for years and years and years, and he came to the monastery, and we kind of found that out after we sent him, because we sent people to the dentist, and he didn't tell us, but the dentist told him at that time that he had 13 cavities. And we found that out eventually, and it's sort of like, we can't let you just let your teeth rot out. You're 25 years old, and you need to have a set of teeth if you want to have good nutrition for the rest of your life. So we paid more than $1,000 to get his fillings filled, because he had this kind of tight sense of getting over attachment to the body. So sometimes people do that by excessive fasting or taking up certain austerities that are a bit too much, and that's straining and getting swept away, being too tight. And the counter, or the comparable activity in the mental realm of self-criticism and guilt, and all the regurgitation and proliferation that we do from things that have happened in the past, particularly with that negative self-criticism. And I found, a useful way of helping to deal with some of that kind of negative self-criticism is to just pause and reflect and ask ourselves the question: if somebody else were telling me this problem that I have, if they were saying the same thing but it was about themselves, how would I react to them? I wouldn't say, "Oh, you stupid, jerk! You're not. You shouldn't be doing that. You're so foolish." We wouldn't be saying that to somebody. We'd be probably more compassionate, more saying, "Oh, okay, well, it's a habit that you have, and it's something to look at and develop a sense of spaciousness and kindness towards." That's how we would respond to somebody who was telling us about that. But how often do we do that to ourselves? It's so much easier for some reason, and I never have quite figured out why, but it's so much easier for us to blame ourselves. We think that it's okay to be angry and critical of ourselves, whereas we would never do that to somebody else. So if you find yourself in that kind of mind state, to say, would I say that to somebody else in the same position? And then learn how to respond in the way that you would like to respond to someone else. So around the flood of becoming, we can sink with that if we're too loose, and we can, if we're tight in that realm, we can get swept away, getting swept away in this over-identification of our roles, our status, being successful, even developing a skill for the wrong reasons, developing a skill to be well known and to be well regarded with that motivation in mind is a way of holding the realm of becoming a bit too tightly. And to just notice that, look at that and see if that's a way that you are in the world. It's not that we shouldn't try and do things in a good way with a sense of excellence, but are we doing that so that we can get praise and success and high standing? Or do we just, lapse into stagnation and laziness and indifference by thinking, oh, it doesn't matter anyway, so, I'm not going to try and do anything well. That would be like of holding that whole notion too loosely and sinking into stagnation, laziness through inaction. Views, the flood of views, we can get really tight, very tight around our views and opinions. As I was mentioning earlier, the political social realm, we get firm, fixed, contentious, indignant, all of those really highly energized, confrontational states of mind when we're holding too tightly to views. At the time of the Buddha, a lot of the examples he gives are all, the different metaphysical declarations that people can make about, the existence of the universe or the non-existence or what happens when you die, and all those beliefs that the Buddha tried to step aside from because that was too, holding things too tightly. Kind of the opposite of that is to, have a sense of, or a belief, a view that that nothing matters. It doesn't, that there's no result of good and bad actions. The whole passivity in terms of the universe. That there's a lack of moral law in the universe, and going all the way to just complete indecision, not holding any kind of judgment about the efficacy of good action. And so one can sink in that kind of a way of holding views too loosely. So, like the belief, the view that anything goes, so you might as well just, not worry about it. So that's the sinking aspect, whereas the contentious aspect is being swept away. And then more broadly, just that flood of ignorance. If we never reflect on the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, we don't bring it up for reflection, then we have no hope of moving beyond our deluded state of existence. And we can sometimes pick things up a bit too strongly, like if we, and this can happen in monastic communities, if the practice isn't going well, we pick up the book learning, the scholarly aspects of the tradition in such a strong way, because it gives, kind of gives a sense of accomplishment or success if we can understand things in an intellectual way, but picking it up with a bit of verve that is a bit too tight. Or you can see it sometimes, say, in more of the lay practice, where you have this kind of the 10-day retreat syndrome, where you can get really involved. And I remember doing this in the early days before I was a monk. Really go to a 10-day retreat and put yourself full on into it and immerse yourself and really get into meditation practice. And then when you leave the 10-day retreat, it all falls apart. And you just go back and do all the things that you were doing before, and you wonder whatever happened to that peaceful state of mind that you had during the 10 days. So kind of like binging on a 10-day retreat, and then complete abandonment of the practice, not being in it. So that can be a few examples of over-striving and getting swept away, unbalanced. And so that the approach is to really develop a lifelong commitment and develop a practice that is steady, even, transportable, movable from one environment to another, inside the retreat, outside the retreat, inside the monastery, outside the monastery. So a continuity of practice with balanced energy. So those are just some of the things that were coming up in my mind as I was reading and thinking about this particular teaching, at least in terms of the day-to-day development of the practice. There's also a real beautiful way of looking at this sutta, which we'll spend more of later on in the afternoon, that points to more of a transcendent aspect of the practice that I find just really a useful contemplation. But this is kind of the nuts and bolts of what most of us are involved with on a day-to-day basis, this kind of middle path, right effort, not too loose, not too tight, and all the different ways that it can affect our approach to overcoming, crossing over the floods.